With only days until the election, all eyes are on the presidential and critical U.S. Senate elections. Hawaii Senator Brian Schatz is here to discuss. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Senator Schatz, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Nice to be here, Mark, and thanks for everything you do to defend democracy.
Thanks. I want to start by asking you about kind of your impressions. You know, I realize you came to the Senate at kind of a very interesting time, which was, you know, the sort of the back half of the Obama administration, and then through obviously the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration. And here we are a few days out from the election. I'm just curious, you know, your take on politics at a sort of a macro level. You know, what you make of what I view as a dramatic rightward, authoritarian lurch of the Republican Party at the national level. You know, kind of what you make of it all.
I mean, look, I'm sort of in the middle of this fight, as I hope all of your listeners are, to try to make sure that the authoritarians don't win. But I think, it's just a fact that this time people actually do know what they're getting out of Donald Trump. I don't think it's going to be surprising. There may be people who try to pretend that they didn't know what they were getting into, but the public by and large knows what they are getting in Donald Trump. And I think that it should give us, I don't know about pause, but it should cause us to think pretty deeply about how the Democratic Party is positioned and what is happening to this country, where you've got a guy who says, you know, daily disqualifying things, and it's just not doing the trick. And the other thing is that we always had an excuse. You know, Joe Biden won, so that was good, and Hillary lost and ran, in my view, a objectively flawed campaign. But now we've got Kamala Harris running a very good campaign, and if it doesn't succeed, then it's not just as simple as sort of saying, the Democrats, they can't shoot straight. There's something going on in society that I think should be, you know, almost more worrisome than the election results. But I just think politics is a game of inches. Life is a game of inches. History is a game of inches. You know, Mark, you know this very well. I was elected by 1,782 votes. Your friend Al Franken was elected by more votes, but a slimmer margin. And so, you know, the course of history is going to be determined not by this sort of like philosophical crap, but on who gets more votes. I won my first state house seat by 425 votes.
Wow.
Maggie Hassan is in the Senate by also the skin of her teeth. And so the thing for us to remember, especially for thoughtful people who are going to comprise, you know, 99.9% of your podcast listeners, you know, what happens next is up to us. It is not for us to ponder about or do navel gazing about or even do like retrospective analysis before the damn thing even happens. What happens next has to do with how hard and how smart we work over the next 2 weeks.
So let me ask you a question before we get to the campaigns, because I want to talk about the campaigns in a second. So you served with Kamala Harris in the Senate. And so I'm just curious, you know, you both had long plane flights. Yours was longer going back home. But I'm just curious, like what was your impressions of her as a person, as a senator, you know, kind of like what do people not know that you know?
Well, I think people have gotten to see her personality over the, you know, since the nomination, and in such a way that I thought was sort of, I'm sure, personally gratifying to her, because she is funny, she is loose, she is easy to get along with. And those were sort of contra to the kind of like pundit class's view of her brand. But she's a very, you know, interesting, easygoing, fun person. And I just do think like the politicos and the punch bowls of the world had decided at the outset that maybe because her comms team was a little over careful, that she also was over careful. She's not really like that. And so she and I, you know, we did some legislation together, nothing too major because we weren't on the same committees. But my recollections of our interactions were more in the kind of space of like being siblings and making a little fun of each other, or being a little sarcastic about, you know, some senior member pontificating a little too long at lunch. but I would just say she was aggressively normal. And I have found a job in United States Senator where if you are normal, then that distinguishes you from everybody. And she was
That's what
like
I like
that.
about, that's what I like most about you.
Yeah, so like people like introduce, and he's normal too. And it's like if I were in an insurance person or a dentist or a realtor or a firefighter, and they said he's normal too, it wouldn't be like that's value add. But in the Senate, if you're even a little bit like a regular person, they kind of consider you to be exceptional. And I think she's like that. She's a person who cooks her own food and does her own workouts, and grew up. She is extraordinary, of course, in terms of her achievement and her capabilities, but she grew up like a lot of us.
Okay, so you are kind of a really interesting person to talk to for a lot of reasons. But one of them is that you are very engaged in making sure that your colleagues win, that Democratic candidates win. You raise money for them online. I mean, like you are sort of everywhere, almost like, speaking of being normal, you're like a normal political junkie, like the rest of us are. And so I want to talk. We're going to get back to the presidential politics in a second, but I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. Senate. So what is your, like, I literally see you constantly doing everything you can for every one of these campaigns. What is your take of where we are?
I mean, here's what I would say is we're like objectively not favored, but we're also like objectively not out of it. So now when you watch NFL football, they'll give you like the win percentage, right? Even into like, so it's like 5 minutes left and we're down a field goal. And you kind of look at the win percentage according to the NFL analytics, and they're like 75. And I'm like, we're down a field goal. Like, I'm not sure if we're down, that we're not that, I just don't believe we're that heavy underdogs. I think John Tester has fought to a statistical tie, which is, of course, a euphemism for being a little bit down. But I do think that projections as to the composition of the electorate could change everything. Reproductive choice is on the ballot in Montana, and Montana is the kind of state where polling is extremely tricky, and just a slight change in the turnout assumptions could cause John Tester to win by his traditional. I think he won by 4 points. Maybe he doesn't win by 4. Maybe he wins by 2. But I think he's very much in it. Sherrod is in a.
So people don't know Sherrod Brown. Sherrod Brown, a senator from Ohio.
My thing is, if you're listening to the Marc Elias podcast, you know who Sherrod Brown is. But Sherrod is not just in a statistical tie; he's in a dead heat tie. And so I'm feeling somewhat more optimistic about that one, even than a couple of weeks ago. I think he's going to win this thing. I don't talk about the Nebraska race. I'm not involved in the Nebraska race. I don't think National Democrats should get involved in the Nebraska race. People can do their own research and make their own assumptions. I think Bobby Casey remains very popular. I think the presidential has tightened over there, which is kind of worrisome, in case there is like total alignment, and sometimes that happens. Slotkin looks great, in my opinion. Jackie Rosen's
Michigan, Slotkin in Michigan. Jackie Rosen in Nevada.
And Jackie Rosen in Nevada, and of course Ruben Gallego in Arizona, I'm feeling very comfortable about. Tammy Baldwin is going to be in a tight race, but it's the kind of tight race where, nobody was ever. Tammy Baldwin was not going to win by 7 points, right? Right. If we win by 70,000 votes, that's just fine. It's a little weird coming from Hawaii, to see these sort of like, unnaturally calm candidates going like, yeah, I'm ahead by 2 3/4 points. Like if I were ever ahead by 2 3/4 points, I'd be quite nervous. But I think like, look, we have a puncher's chance at retaining the Senate, and similar to, from a projections standpoint, where we were in, 4 years ago when we were not expected to take the Senate, and we won those 2 Georgia seats. So are we favored? No. Were we favored the last 2 cycles? No. And we keep winning. That doesn't mean we do this time, but it certainly means that it's not time to give up hope. I think we still have a, not just non-zero, but a real shot at maintaining the majority.
Great. And what do you what does your gut tell you about where the presidential stands?
I have less data and I have less gut because some of these states I've only been to, a few. I mean, obviously, I've been to Pennsylvania numerous times, Philadelphia, but I'm not in Western Pennsylvania or Southern Pennsylvania, so I just don't know, and I'm not sure I trust my own instincts on this. But we are still ahead, and I think that the vice president is closing with a very clear message about freedom and economic prosperity and democracy. And Trump is closing with a bunch of crap that is designed to activate memes. Now, could that work? Sure. But I still think that if I know anything about politics, I would still rather have a disciplined campaign that is spending money on things that are attractive to voters, that is mobilizing the grassroots, that actually has a real GOTV operation. So I think, we're about to finish strong and they're about to finish chaotically. Could it all not matter? Sure. But at that point, you're just talking yourself into being pessimistic. It's also true that I could get in a car accident this afternoon, but I'll be vigilant not to. But that doesn't mean I'm going to spend the rest of the afternoon worrying. If we execute, we will win. And if everybody takes all of that nervous energy and turns it into Twitter nonsense or just refreshing the polls and seeing if there's some new data point that's either going to make them miserable or jubilant, then we're going to lose. The point here is to spend the last 2 weeks campaigning.
All right. I meant to ask you in the Senate map to say a little bit about Texas and Florida. I know that they're both states that you have spoken about before, and I'm curious your sense of them.
Yeah, I think for Florida, there's a very specific thing going on, which is that Rick Scott's not spending any money, and neither is Mitch McConnell. And the chatter is that it's a bit of a staring contest between the two of them on who's going to, spend money. I'm sure Rick Scott has internal polls that show him ahead enough that is, it's causing him not to want to, open up his own checkbook. But gosh, I love the idea of a very disciplined, very talented candidate in Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, reproductive choice on the ballot.
Literally on the ballot, so that people don't know. It's literally on the ballot.
It's literally on the ballot as a ballot amendment. Yeah. And I think, I think she's finishing strong. My theory about Florida is as follows. Sure, DeSantis made it look like a bright red state. And sure, we as a party have been tantalized and then disappointed in consecutive cycles. And so we don't necessarily want to dump $300 million in there to lose by 1.5. But Bill Nelson lost by, I think, fewer than
a tenth of a percent.
Yeah, 1/10%.
Not 1%, a 1/10%.
Yeah, and then DeSantis goes and sort of mops the floor with the Florida Democrats. Here's what I think. I think there are Florida people who are pro-choice, who are pro-LGBTQ, who were probably anti-vax, who were probably anti-COVID restrictions. And one of the reasons you move to Florida is to have the government leave you the fuck alone. And so I think there's a Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, Ron DeSantis voter out there who's which one of these candidates is likely to give me more of my freedoms back? And I think that's the theory of the case. I don't know this as a sort of data analytics person. I just think that the case she's making is one that I could see being compelling. On the Texas side, I just think, it's very, very close now. And Colin Allred is hitting all of his notes. And it is legitimately close. That's not an outlier, but this thing is damn close. And I think that Beto is an extraordinary talent who came within a couple of percentage points. And that Texas's political evolution, demographic evolution, probably gives us a half a point or a point in our direction, since that last race. Plus which I think we have a candidate who is, and again, I do love Beto, but I think in Colin Allred, we have someone who is more attractive to exurbs and suburbs and rural areas he's a big football player. He's
Yeah.
a, you know, he's a dude's dude. And he's a nice guy. He's a family guy. He's a likable guy. But I think there are, some voters out there who are not looking to vote for a Republican, but rather just more attracted to someone who, looks like someone they would hang out with. And I think that on that count, between Beto and Ted, there were probably a lot of voters who go like, I probably can't relate to either of these people.
Right.
With Colin and Ted, you're going, yeah, Colin seems like he'd be nice. And he'd bring over like either a case of beer or like some barbecue, and we'd watch football and he'd be chill. Like he wouldn't dominate the conversation, and he'd be on his phone like the rest of us tracking his fantasy teams. And maybe he knows a couple players from Baylor that are still in the league or whatever the hell. But he just seems like normal enough where I think that we might be doing better both in South Texas, where we lost some Hispanic support, and also just like and he'll do great in Houston and Dallas and Austin. But I also think it's the exurbs where we need to start not just, losing by less, but we need to start flipping those suburbs and exurbs.
Yeah, and the two things I'd add, is number one, Rick Scott has a history of very close elections. Like Rick Scott has never been popular in Florida. Like even when he was spending and spending and spending and spending, it's not just that he barely won that Senate race. He didn't run up big margins when he was running for governor either. Like people in Florida don't particularly like him. That doesn't mean that he will lose, but it's not like he's a beloved figure. And when it comes to Ted Cruz has real popularity problems. I mean, setting aside, Colin, who I agree with you, Allred, who is a phenomenally talented candidate and a very likable and a former NFL player and a star at Baylor. Ted Cruz, again, has done a lot to alienate voters in his home state. So I think both of those races are interesting to look at.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to ask you, and you probably don't get asked this a lot, but I'm actually fascinated by it. So I'm going to ask. Tell us about Hawaii politics. People, we every 4 years, we hear that, there was once an elector thing that went on in Hawaii in 1960, which suggested it was a very close state, which it used to be actually a very evenly divided state politically. It is now sort of just assumed to be a very democratic state. So, like, for people who don't know why Hawaii is democratic, like, what do you tell them about the politics of Hawaii?
Well, the short version of the history, right, is that my predecessor and his colleagues, Dan Inouye, and the members of the 442nd and the 100th fought in World War II and knew that they were returning home. And Japanese Americans were being interned in California, Colorado, and elsewhere, and mostly not in Hawaii, because of the great work of Dan and John Burns and others who basically vouch for the patriotism of these Americans with Japanese ancestry in Hawaii. So there were people interned, but it wasn't the mass internment that we saw elsewhere. But they decided that, we fought and sacrificed for this country. And in the case of Dan Inouye, lost his arm fighting the fascists, and they said, we're not going to come home to being second-class citizens. And so they all endeavored to, some of them went to law school, some of them didn't, some of them convalesced for a while. Dan had to recover from his injury and relearn, how to live with his new disability. But they all then entered the legislature, and we had what we called the Democratic Revolution, which was essentially Americans of Japanese ancestry, the ILWU and the other unions saying, we are not going to tolerate this relegation of whole communities of people, mostly people of color, Filipino, Chinese, Portuguese, Native Hawaiian, and Japanese, and that was the start of the Democratic Revolution. And the state of Hawaii has been democratic ever since, which is to distinguish it from being liberal. It is not that liberal.
That's good. That's good. That's good. Okay, so say
blue.
more.
It's blue and it's reasonably progressive, but it is not like reflexively progressive. We have a lot of relatively mainstream, sort of center-left Democrats, reliable, sort of base type Democrats, think communities of color all across the country they are the base of the Democratic Party, but they're not the left of the Democratic Party. They're the base of the Democratic Party. So that's one thing. We are occasionally capable of electing a Republican chief executive. Linda Lingle served for 2 terms as governor, and so there is this instinct, as there is in Massachusetts and Vermont and elsewhere, when you have a Democratic New York, you have a Democratic dominated legislative body. Sometimes there's a desire to put a sort of center right moderate there, just as a check. But anytime anything gets federalized, a la Maryland, none of those people can get elected to federal office. So we remain blue, but I am cognizant of, just like anywhere else, there's a little bit more of a rural-urban divide than there used to be. And I think frankly, the COVID experience, having local government being run by Democrats, and the sort of frustration around, working class individuals being told, A, you can't work, B, you can't send your kid to school, and C, it's going to be a while before you get any government assistance, was frustrating for folks. And so one of the kind of like personally grounding experiences, not like at the electoral level, but just in terms of my service to the people of Hawaii, is to understand that, I am in the policymaking space. I'm not on the execution side. I'm on the legislative side. But we still really have to have an eye towards, it is not good enough to pass a bill. You actually have to help. You have to make sure that people get the help that you are claiming that they are going to get. Otherwise, the promise of government itself, and certainly Democrats in charge of the government, becomes deeply, deeply undermined in an almost generational way. And I have friends who have basically affiliated with the Democratic Party forever, who turned away from Democrats because technically if you do one of those what issues do you believe in, these guys all, they're Democrats, but they hate Democrats, right? And I think that's something that we have to come to terms with, which is people agree with us, but they're not so fond of us. And that's something we've got to work on.
One other Hawaii question that I want to talk about: national voting rights and democracy. So I happen to know this because one of my closest friends in high school is from Hawaii and went to Punahou. I know you are a graduate, as is Barack Obama, the former president. So did you know him? Is he a neighbor? Did you run into him at the local mart?
So he's 10 years older than me. So we obviously didn't overlap in high school. I'm friends with his sister, with whom we did overlap. And obviously we have some mutual teachers in common and a few friends in common. My state house district was right across the street from Punahou School. And he at one time lived on Pokey Street, and so did I, but not in the same decade. So
all right.
We have never, we know each other. We have never overlapped, but I am not his golfing buddy. And I have tried for decades to become his pickup basketball buddy, but to no avail.
All right. Well, we tried.
But I was just listening to a podcast, and I actually felt, the reason I'm thinking about this is he was just on some big basketball podcast. I forgot which one. And I realized I really did text his people. I'm like, hey, if he's looking for a 9th or a 10th or whatever. And he's just told this story about he was playing with Steph and LeBron and D-Wade. And I was like, oh, okay, well, never mind. I wouldn't invite myself either.
That's hilarious. We'll be right back with more of my conversation with Senator Schatz, but I want to let you know about the exciting virtual Democracy Docket events we're hosting next week. First, on Monday, October 28th at 7 p.m., we're hosting a live discussion with Stacey Abrams, Maria Teresa Kumar, and Eva Longoria to talk about 2 key questions. What could happen between now and the election, and what should we expect to happen afterwards? And then on Tuesday, October 29th at 7 p.m., I'm thrilled to be joined by Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin and Brian Tyler Cohen to preview what to expect in the post-election period, especially if, as we expect, it is too close to call. Both events are live and free to attend. Click the links in the show notes below to sign up for both. All right, so let's talk about sort of the fate of our democracy. You sit on both the Appropriations Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee, among others. And so you kind of see the domestic and the foreign side of things. And it feels like, as much as we focus on democracy at stake in this November and the challenges we face domestically, this feels like a more global challenge. So talk a little bit about how you see where democracy stands as an issue, and whether some of the critiques, frankly, that you're making about the Democratic Party and about people's disillusionment, whether you think that is a uniquely American phenomenon, whether it's an international phenomenon, whether it's just sort of they rhyme but they're not the same.
I think they rhyme, and I'm sure they're not the same, but I couldn't even tell you in which ways they are not the same. There's clearly a global fascist movement now. They are aligned both explicitly and vibrationally. But I mean, there are funding resources, and there's coordination internationally for this new fascist movement. But I think that the lesson to take from that, I mean, obviously there's an electoral aspect to this, where we may want to point out to at least the sliver of voters who consider themselves like Reagan internationalist types. We may want to make that case, but the broader takeaway is that there's no vanquishing this movement in 2 weeks. And there are, a buddy of mine, Chuck Friedman, who was my very close advisor in the state of Hawaii, no final defeats, no final victories, right? And even as, the resolution of this presidential election is super consequential for Americans, for America, for the international order, it's also important to remember that whatever happens next is not the end of this conversation about whether the global fascist movement is eventually vanquished or sort of wins over democracy. My buddy Chris Murphy talks about the fact that democracy is not necessarily, historically speaking, the natural state of things. Right. It is the exception to the rule. And so, it's a little bit like it's a republic if you can keep it, but it is not a natural state of being. It is something we have to fight for every day. It's something we have to maintain every day. And if Kamala wins, great, we maintain it every day. If Kamala doesn't win, not great, but not over either. And I think, this is not to diminish the importance of what happens on November 5th, but just to understand that the context here is a little bit like how I view about like the climate battle, which is I have entered the federal arena specifically so I can try to make an impact on climate. And we did fail for a long time, and then we succeeded. Right. And yet you just wake up the next morning and keep going, right? Whether you failed it, like we passed the biggest climate action in human history. Okay, what do I check the box and say climate solved? Like, no, that's not how this damn thing works. This is a generational challenge. And likewise, fighting fascism is not something, these people aren't going away. This movement isn't going away. We have to get better and better at vanquishing it. And I also think like we as Democrats love to nitpick each other. And
yeah, indeed we do.
And do a bunch of like pre-buttals of ourselves. And so, that's the other part of this is that we have to understand the context is lots of incumbent parties coming out of the COVID recession, have gotten their asses handed to them. And the fact that our party, and this is something I'm very proud of, our party was one of in history, showed a bunch of clarity, moral clarity and political clarity on what was necessary in order for us to put our best foot forward. That started with Joe Biden understanding that, he would better serve the country by focusing on the presidency and stepping aside from the presidential campaign, but down to Kamala and how her team has executed and how Senate Democrats have comported themselves. Like there is a lot to be proud of as a party that can look at a problem and for whatever our faults, like actually solve it. That doesn't mean we win. It just means we're capable of solving problems. There is not a chance in the world that the Republican Party facing a similar dilemma would have fixed it. And so I'm still proud to be a Democrat, and I don't want this to be a eulogy. I still think we're going to win on Tuesday, but I also feel like we need to acknowledge that we are doing everything that we can and that if we know anything about politics, when you do everything you can, you usually win. It's just that not every time, Mark, and you know that.
Yeah. And, one of the realizations I've come to in the last few months, and actually Sarah Longwell, who was on the podcast, was the catalyst in my thinking about this, is I think that a lot of Democrats, and myself included, have envisioned that there is this one Titanic battle. And if we win, all the Republicans wake up and are like, wait a second, this whole Trump thing was all a mistake. And we sort of snap back to kind of a Romney, McCain era of Republican politics. And her point to me is that that's actually not true, that there's very little appetite among the current Republican Party for that kind of politics, that Trumpism, regardless of whether it is in the form of Donald Trump or not, will continue. And so, to your point, it's not like even if Democrats win the House and win the Senate and win the presidency, that somehow
the fever breaks.
Yeah, her point is that won't happen, and that there will be a continued need to continue.
And I don't want to be an apologist for my wimpy colleagues on the Republican side for not having stood up to Trump. But part of what Sarah and others have pointed out is it is actually the voters.
Right. That is her point. That actually is her
responding to they are going home and getting shouted at by people they have known for 30 years. And they will tell, me, these are local, construction company or some school board member or some church friend who, they're center right, they're uncomfortable with abortion, they don't want too much social change, and they want low taxes, and they hate the, waters of the U.S. rule about, the Clean Water Act. But but now they're just frothing about stuff that they have been fed by the internet. But to your point, it's not like they're going to all huddle and go hey, this Trump thing is not working for us. We've lost a couple of elections in a row, and it's time for us to find, that next generation of Ben Sass or something. It ain't happening. Ben Sass retired, right? Mitt Romney retired, and there's a reason for all that. And so, yeah, the Republican. But that means all that is left for us to do is beat them. And something will have to come out of the ashes of the Republican Party, but I think this assumption that this battle ends on November 5th is a little bit, written in the wind.
Yeah. So I want to talk about federal legislation because I know you have been a big proponent of federal voting rights legislation. You've been a sponsor and a co-sponsor of some really important, some of the most important bills. You among other things, have been instrumental in the inclusion and the expansion of Native American Voting Rights Act within the coalition of Voting Rights Act reforms. You and I had many a long conversation during the discussion of the Freedom to Vote Act. And I'm curious, what people who care enormously about these issues should be thinking. And maybe your words about climate is the words that people like me need to hear, which is that I just look out and I'm like, okay, how are we going to get these bills passed? We need them. We need the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advantage Act. We need to protect voting rights at the federal level. We need to expand it to cover Native Americans who are treated terribly in so many ways by our voting laws. What do you say to people like me who are just despondent that we have not gotten this done and it feels like we're not going to get it done?
Well, I don't have encouraging words other than we just have to win. We just have to win. And then we can enact these things. And if we don't, we can't. But on the Native American Voting Rights Act, people don't quite understand how challenging it is if you live on Native land, particularly reservation land. Mm-hmm. It might be 100 miles to the polling place, and understand that there's no regular U.S. postal service. And so, for a lot of people, it's 6 gallons of gas, 9 gallons of gas to drop off a ballot. And so what people do, right, is they make their run to town to get their groceries, right? And they'll drop off a bunch of ballots. It has to be permissible, right, for someone to carry someone else's ballots on the way in. And that is the thing that people call ballot harvesting, right? And this is just simply making sure that the logistics work for families, for tribes, for communities who are like, there's all this talk on the Republican side about respecting rural communities, and they make a big exception for Native communities because they are the most rural of rural communities, and they are aggressively disrespected in terms of their daily life. And so to me, allowing a tribal ID to be your official government ID, which of course it is, right? Making sure that there's a drop box or a way to vote in every precinct is important. Allowing people to, get assistance in the collection of ballots. All of those are things that on a one-by-one basis, nobody really has any ability to rebut. It's just that, this is becoming team red, team blue. Now, on Native voting rights, we have actually, traditionally had some pretty good allies in Tom Cole and in Lisa Murkowski and others. And so we're still hopeful to be able to put that together on a bipartisan basis, as we did with the Violence Against Women Act and the tribal provisions there. But on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, like, there's only one way forward, and it's 51 votes in the Senate.
Yeah, 51 Democrats, and that is unfortunately probably means at least 50 Democrats if Lisa Murkowski is on board with it, because I don't think, as I recall, I don't think there was another Republican senator who indicated any support for any of the voting rights bills.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, it also means having a Democratic House because there were no Republicans in the House.
Yeah, I'm like hopeful about the Senate, nervous but hopeful about the presidency. I'm a little bullish on the House, but I will say I don't track those votes. That's just vibes.
Yeah. So I want to say a word about something you brought up because I think it's really important for the audience to hear this, and then I'm happy for your reaction. So let's take the state of Arizona. Okay, the state of Arizona wanted for years to ban ballot collection. Okay, this is neighbors collecting the ballots of their neighbors and, as you said, driving them and dropping them off at the county in order to vote. People don't realize in Arizona about 85% of voters vote by mail. And if you're on a Native American reservation in Arizona, vote by mail is essentially your only option. Okay. And so Republicans for many years wanted to ban this practice as a way, frankly, to disenfranchise Latino and Native voters. And what prevented them from doing that was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. The Department of Justice would not pre-clear those changes precisely because they negatively impacted Latino and Native American voters. So what happened in 2013? The Supreme Court strikes down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County. So what does the Republican legislature in Arizona do immediately? Well, they enact a ban on this ballot collection at the same time that they provide no greater resources for people to be able to vote who are not, who are living, as you say, hundreds of miles from the place in which they need to drop off their ballot. And so it is a mass disenfranchisement effort. And, the Democratic Party of Arizona, the DNC, the DSCC, and others brought litigation to try to remedy this. It went to they won at the lower courts. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against them in a case called Brnovich versus DNC. And the losers in this, when all the pundits, sort of focus on these cases and say, well, this case said this and this case said that, the real losers in that case were the voters who now face exactly the problem that you laid out. And so, when people talk in the abstract about a Supreme Court case, or they talk in the abstract about a bill or a provision or ballot harvesting, what they are ignoring is the devastating consequences that it has for these communities who have been targeted with disenfranchisement and have actually then, as a result, been disenfranchised. And then people turn around and say, well, why don't these communities vote? Well, because you've made it so damn hard for them to vote.
Yeah, I mean, you got it exactly right. I don't have a good response other than to say there is a remedy here, and it is passing the statute that we've all co-sponsored, and we are on the cusp of it, right? Like if we take the Senate and we do not have, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema it's very likely we'll be able to enact this without supermajority requirement. And it's important to enshrine these essentially constitutional rights in statutory law. But, as Raphael Warnock says, people should choose their politicians, and politicians shouldn't be allowed to choose their voters. Mm-hmm. And that's what this is. This is selecting techniques of voting based on their likelihood of supporting a certain party in power. And that's just gross on its face.
It is. And it's, it is, when you came to the Senate, you may remember there was the RNC did a study which has become known as the Autopsy Report. It was the mm-hmm. autopsy of the 2012 election. And their prescription, if you go back and read it, was essentially, we need to appeal to more voters. Like we need to find a way to soften on immigration. We need to soften on some of these issues that are alienating young voters, women, voters of color, because we need to attract more voters. And it feels like Donald Trump's election in 2016 was a repudiation of that. And instead, it is how do we get the rules so that we don't need to attract more voters.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And they've gone all in on this strategy, which is why this, look, the most important thing we can all do is send money to these Senate campaigns and, get on one of those online phone banks and email your old cousin or your high school friend. Like one of these races is going to be close enough, and one of these races is going to be the difference maker. So, that's my message to all your listeners is like, it's great that you are the kind of person who listens to the daily podcast and Marc Elias and maybe Sarah Longwell. And I'm that person too. But we should be spending 90% of our energy on vote getting at this point. And then we can enrich our brains later.
All right. So I have two final questions for you. The first is something that someone, believe it or not, on Twitter tweeted at me to ask you. So I'm going to ask. When you do these Twitter things where you're like, hey, Corey, like, how about for Thursday, we raise money for, people want to know, is that spontaneous, or do you know who you're going to raise money for?
It's mostly spontaneous. I'm not saying we've never planned one, but it's mostly spontaneous. And there's a little bit of, everybody's busy. So sometimes you'll like take a swing at something and it's like, oh shit, Murphy's in Africa, right? Or whatever it is. And so like when you're like at Chris Murphy and then you get nothing back, it's a little bit of a challenge. So we now try to like do a quick text string to say like, want to tweet for so-and-so. And then we just, but it's not scripted in any sense of the world. But we try to do, at least make sure that we're all online at roughly the same time.
Yeah, which when you're back in the district, it's got to be hard, right? When you're back in the state, it's got to be hard because you're on a very different time zone.
In a way, it's a little easier for me, right? Because I'm, if it's midnight for them, it's 6 p.m. for me. Like we're fine. No one's tweeting at 6 a.m. All
right. I won't ask you, but do your colleagues ask you to do it? Like, are people like, hey?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because as you know, like, hey, can you do an email for me, or can you show up in Madison and do a, so this is just another means of a fundraising. Yes.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of fun. I mean, it is not only are you doing good, but it's also for those of us who like follow you all. It's actually just like refreshing to see senators interacting with each other as like normal people, because like when we see you on the floor, you're always like, well, the gentleman from and the
right.
Mr. President or whatever. Like it's good to see.
Yeah, well, yeah, we are some of us normal.
All right. I won't ask whether there is a bar to normalcy to like get into that club or not. But I'm going to ask you a different normal question as my final question. So yeah, and you started to answer this, but I want you to like answer it really directly, because the biggest question I get, like the biggest anxiety is people out there, they are constantly emailing me and writing in and saying, what can I do? I am terrified. Like you said, they're like, I read the polls every day. I read Democracy Docket. I listen to your podcast. I listen to every podcast. Like I am watching the news, but what can I do? Because I'm not a U.S. senator with a big Twitter account. I am not, voting rights lawyer go to court? Like, what is it I'm sure people ask you this all the time. Like, what is it if you are an everyday American, you're living your life, but you are worried, what for the next week or so can people do?
Three things. Give money. Look, I'm always cautious to tell people to give money if I think it's just going to be incinerated. But we are because we're defending so many seats and we're doing well, but we're defending Nevada and Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. It's just a very expensive enterprise. We are not fully funded in really any of those races. So it is a fact that your money will, especially now, especially if it's online and not a check, it will be immediately wired to either a social media company, a TV station, or a radio station, and it will be used for communicating with voters. So money first. Make phone calls or knock on doors. That's easy enough. Vote Save America. Maybe Democracy Docket also has some resources, but there's plenty of ways to find and sort of online phone bank. So money or communicating directly with voters. And this is something I don't always say because I think it's a little bit, it's like the third tier, but I think we are in the, is there anything I can do phase of this? Look, it's true that Twitter is not real life. It's true that Facebook is not real life, but we can't project an air of anxiety all the way through for the next 2 weeks. Like that is not winning. That is not a winning attitude. Like I'm only 5'7.5".
Which might be why you don't get invited to the basketball games. Did it ever occur? I wasn't going to bring this up, but it ever occurred to you that's why Obama doesn't invite you?
No, I think it's stature. But anyway, maybe it's both kinds of stature. But anyway, that's not, I played water polo in high school. I played, a competitive low-level athlete, right? And people who think they're going to lose. And so sometimes you can pull it out anyway, right? But there was always something about, the Buffalo Bills, right? There was always something about the Portland Trailblazers where you go like, they're going to like trip on their shoelaces in the end, right? And so I just want us all vibrationally, especially online, to convey not a sense of overconfidence, not a sense of complacency, but a sense of a campaign on the move, a campaign that knows what it's about and knows who we're communicating for and to. And so, like, the last thing we should do is sort of perseverate over tactical choices that we have no control over or complain about some bullshit that we're not even, like, listen, Kamala does a thing with Liz Cheney. That's great. It's also not what she's communicating with most voters about, right? Like all the TV throw weight, all the gross ratings points are like a very mainstream economic message and a pro-choice message. So don't get it twisted that your job is to be chief strategist. At this point, everybody becomes a cheerleader. There's an old HBO movie about the Iowa caucuses when Obama won. And Paul Tooze, who I'm not sure if you ever met him, but he was
Paul is an old friend. Paul.
Oh, okay.
Paul was a Senate guy before Paul worked for Obama. Paul worked at the DSCC. Paul was a Daschle guy.
So there's a really cool clip, and I actually haven't been able to find it. So send it to me if you can find it.
I'll find it. One of our listeners will find this, and then I'll send it to you.
So Paul's there with all the volunteers in the Iowa headquarters before the Iowa caucuses, and Paul, very intense guy.
Yes.
Full on like operative's operative. So you can picture this guy even without me describing him to you. And he just goes, I'm knocking doors. Finance knocks doors. Comms knocks doors. The candidates knocking doors. Everybody knock doors. And the point is, I don't care if you have a law degree. I don't care if you have senator in front of your name. At this point, there's nothing to do except communicate with voters. And that is the way we're going to win.
Well, Senator Schatz, that is an inspirational way to end this, and I'm sure Paul Tooze will love the shout out that he got. But thank you for everything you do for democracy. Thank you for everything you do for Democrats. I mean, you are really an inspiration on that front. And you are, Barack Obama had a lot of reasons for running for president. And the most compelling reason I ever heard him give, which he said publicly and he would say in smaller groups as well, is people would say, well, it's, you're so new to the Senate. Why are you running for president already? Why don't you wait? And he would say, because I'm closer to normal now than I will ever be. We are closer to the daily problems that the American people have, student loans, affording groceries. Like, I'm closer to that now than I will be in 8 years or 16 years or whatever. And you are definitely among the most normal, if not the most normal U.S. senator. So whatever you're doing to keep that, bottle it and share it with your colleagues. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Nice to see you, Mark.
Thanks. Thanks so much for joining this episode of Defending Democracy. Make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters to stay up to date on the latest voting rights and democracy news. We'll see you next time.